So we're back with another update video regarding the changes that happened this past week. It ended up being a little bit more tricky. I was out of town, so I couldn't do a further follow-up. But today we're going to go ahead and cover some of the different changes that I did not expect, and specifically this part of the weapon balancing, which we were not aware of when we were able to test the game early. We knew the health change was coming, but this other part is significantly a bigger change than maybe even the health change, because of what we'll talk about in a quick second. So it says the new changes to player health outlined in Warzone section and the application of armor damage ultimately result in a time to kill feeling slower, more consistent, definitely, and more reactable at every engagement distance. While a select few weapons are listed below, it is important to note that most weapons will see their effectiveness altered as a result of the change to armor damage. For now, we will be retiring the term armor damage, and any future changes that are Warzone specific will be followed by Warzone only. Up until this point, we had base health was mirrored between multiplayer and Warzone, but on top of that, they had armor damage profiles where you did different damage if the person that you're shooting had armor, and then as soon as you broke the armor, then it went to the multiplayer damage values for that first 100 health or whatever the case is. Now with the 150 and the 150 plates, they've completely removed this, which kind of does a clamping effect, which I'll clarify here to kind of help, because it can be a little confusing exactly what's happening. So on True Game Data site, if we look at the lock, we see that it has the max armor damage at 33, and you can see it's already taking effect here. This previously, before the update, was 42. So it got a heavy nerf in this first damage range if you landed headshots. In terms of the minimum armor damage, the close range wasn't impacted. As we go to the furthest range, we can go ahead and kind of see how this changes up a little bit, where before this was 18 to all of these areas, so it got a 4 damage buff, and then the headshot was left unaffected. And we'll kind of see how this looks in terms of a clamping effect. So it kind of makes a little bit more sense specifically for this weapon. So this isn't actually on the site, but I want to demonstrate it using similar graphs that make sense. And what we can see right here is that we can see the lowest damage value at the various ranges. So this would have been the 28 damage at the closest range, all the way up to 30-ish meters, 33, I believe. And then that would drop down, and then we'd end up with the damage profile of 24. And then that would go all the way down here to 22 or 23, I believe. And then it goes all the way over here and then drops down to 18. Prior to the update, that's pretty much how it worked. And then there would be that clamping effect that you see with these yellow dotted lines for armor only. What this means now is that the TTKs are getting a huge clamping effect, whereas this highest value, which before, as I mentioned, was 42 damage, is heavily clamped and brought down to that 33 damage. So that is like a 9 damage reduction here in this first section, and then lower here, and then less here. And then you can kind of see it doesn't impact it once it's within the boundaries. So that means that the TTK can pretty much only appear in this area, or at least the damage values. So it's kind of narrowed that down, and that really hurts some weapons, specifically on sniper support, because now they can't do a high headshot. This impacted SMGs a little bit harder than it did as rifles, because the rifles at the longest range, most of them are getting that buff from the lower damage. A lot of them are, but it's not really impacting the TTK that much because of the health. But up close, SMGs, as we'll see in a quick second, got nerfed heavily, and it kind of makes it so that only the new SMG shines, which is the ISO 45. Hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer for you, because I know it is a little bit trickier. So these are the new TTKs, factoring in those clamping effect for pretty much all of these weapons, and the shot combination that True Game Data already has on their site that makes it super easy to kind of calculate what is a realistic TTK if you landed 100% of your shots. So that's the other part you kind of got to factor in this. You would think that all of a sudden everyone would jump on the SO14, which I think that is good for a very high skilled player. I know a lot of people were gassing it up even prior to this update, saying how amazing it was. I think people are going to start using it because of this difference, just because the TTK is so good, but there's still some pretty good options that I think eventually will be there, because generally, unless the TTK is just ridiculous, maybe if this had like a 600 TTK, I could see everyone jumping on board the SO14, but because it does not, and I think people generally do not like to have spammy weapons that where they have to focus on aim, maybe keep it on more mouse a little bit more, but in general, when you're on a controller and you're having it spam and having to aim, it just doesn't really work out quite as well. but in general, it can work if it has a ridiculously broken TTK, like we saw with DMR back in Warzone 1. But right here, I think what might come out a little bit ahead is the TAC-V as people get a little more hands on it, because the TTK isn't a huge difference, especially since the TAC-V is a little easier to use. But that being said, I think in general, people will like the consistency of the Lockman because of the damage per mag and the recoil. Obviously, it isn't the fastest TTK by any means compared to a lot of these other ones, but the other upsides that it has kind of offsets it. And this isn't that big a difference to say, hey, you know what? If the RPK recoil is more than Lockman, why would you use the RPK? You're not going to get close to this 1000 TTK. You're going to get a much higher TTK. Same with the 7.62, harder to use, smaller mag. M4, harder to use, still pretty good mag. STB, small mag. M13, damage per mag sucks. So you kind of have all these that would be better if in a perfect world where the mag size was good, but now we end up with the Lockman sub. If you're wondering what these X's are, this is generally what people have started using. And I think as we narrow down, there'll be a true meta. But what's really great about right now is you can use a lot of these weapons. It really is going to come down to comfort. I think these are like the tippity top meta like focus right now. But I think in the next coming days and weeks, these will slowly evolve, and potentially we might even see more weapon balancing, because I think when it comes to the SMGs, it is a little bit more broad. What we could use if the ISO was slightly nerfed, or we got a couple of them slightly buffed, because some got some pretty harsh penalties with this damage change that I was talking about. So we have the ISO 45, which is the brand new SMG, the fastest TTK. 600 is kind of like the benchmark of where we'd like to see the TTKs for weapons. So I think it's in a good spot. Rather than nerfing it to match the rest of the guns, I think we could actually see some of these guns receive a buff. MX9 would need a mag change. I think Lockman sub could kill in one less bullet. It would be around 640, 630 TTK, which would still be good. Damage per mag would be nice. Chimera has always mirrored that. Still a little bit of wonky weapon for some. I don't really like the iron sights, but you got that. Vaznev still pretty good, usable. I think people are still using this one as well. Those are kind of like the three, just because the versatility of the Lockman sub allows you to down and thirst multiple people, versus the ISO, you'll probably get 2 downs and maybe a thirst. But overall, what we'll be focusing on are the SO14, TAC-V, Lockman, and then the ISO. I already covered the Lockman sub and the Vaznev, pretty much the same builds. I don't think the Vaznev is as good as the Lockman, but you can go ahead and use them at least until you get the ISO 45, which is the absolute meta right now. I think people are using these ones just because they haven't had enough playtime with the ISO, but the ISO 45 just kills that much faster. Unfortunately, MX9 doesn't have a big enough mag. Here is the build for the SO14. Like I said, not necessarily the biggest fan of spamming weapons, but pretty good. Like if you can get the decent trigger finger, the problem is you got to land a certain number of shots, which can be a little bit trickier on the follow-up shots. It's also interesting that they updated here where you get a little bit of blood mist on those. So pretty straightforward on that weapon. I think, like I said, it'll be a little more challenging, and people like the fast TTK. But TAC-V kind of also fits in that niche of fast TTK. A little bit harder to use, but better TTK. So you kind of get rewarded for hitting your shots, which is something I'm always a fan of with TTKs, and having faster TTKs for harder to use weapons. So there's a trade-off. There's like that sacrifice where you might lose a little bit of inconsistency, or lose a little bit of consistency to get a faster TTK. So it could hurt you and help you in different scenarios, depending on the range, if they're on a head glitch, if that like variables come into play, and then obviously the person's skill. So then we have it here, pretty straightforward build, nothing crazy. If the recoil is still a little bit much for you, you can go ahead and get rid of the high velocity and switch to like a rear grip. Since it doesn't really have a barrel that's going to help quite as much with recoil control. It has hipfire recoil control, which doesn't really help, and then bullet velocity here, but without the recoil control. So I would go probably with the rear grip, probably something like this, which is the combat grip, which is the control, recoil control there, or you could even go with the stock, which is going to help you there, but it might slow you down too much. But this is the other one I would go with if you're looking for a little bit more control with this. And we'll go ahead and check this out now, and then I'll go ahead and kind of show you how that works. So a little bit of initial recoil can be a little bit tricky on the target, which I think that's where I think most people will struggle. A little bit at range, a medium range, this thing will be very good because of the TTK, very similar to the SO. But once you get about 75 meters, it could get a little bit tricky. So you could always drop that and then go ahead and, like I said, put on something like this. And then we got this here. And you can see it is going to be a little bit straighter. But like I said, the recoil is going to become less of an issue, and the bullet velocity might struggle where you feel like you're getting ghost bullets, like the bullet's not hitting where you're aiming. And that's kind of where this weapon will suffer without that added bullet velocity, since we are not running a suppressor, which would normally solve for that bullet velocity. And we're not running a barrel, and we're not running, so you're losing out all that part of it. So it'd be great mid-range. And then we also have the long range 5.56, which is the same one I covered in my previous video. Pretty much kind of see how it lays out there. This one by far will be the laser accurate, like a kilo, pretty decent fast fire rate. You shouldn't be able to miss shots with aim assist, particularly. You shouldn't be able to miss, but also on keyboard and mouse, you should be able to pretty much aim at where the target is. So this one's going to be like good all around for various skill levels, low, intermediate, advanced players for the absolute most consistency. But like we already saw, it doesn't kill quite as fast as the other ones. So in the rare occasions where somebody is just hitting their shots, they will kill you faster, and there's nothing you can do with this gun. So that's the trade-off. But you're always going to be able to get the same TTK because you're not going to miss. And then, like I said, we have the ISO, which has the fastest TTK currently in that setup. So pretty much this is kind of how that one's built out. Straightforward. This one's built more for aim down sight. A little bit of lack of recoil control because of the way we're building it out, but it still has relatively good recoil control. I am not a fan of the iron sight, so I would probably drop one of these, particularly probably the rear grip, because I like the ability to have aim walking speed, which is strafe speed, something this game desperately needs. If they do that, that's one of the last changes I really want. Obviously, some people want slide canceling or other types of movement or whatever. Strafing would be, oh my God, it's just so boring sometimes how you have to challenge a gunfight. You're kind of limited. You can't even strafe. And then you could put on optic, whatever you would normally run for your optic, which normally I tend to go with the Cronin Pro, and then that gives me like a blue dot. But obviously on SMG, it's a little taboo to use an optic. So there you go. That is an option for you if you want to use that. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.